Sermons in Exodus with Dr. Bryan Murawski. Exodus 1, 1-7, the beginning of a nation. Exodus 6, 6-8 reads, "Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord." In many ways, Exodus is a foundational book of the Bible. Some have even said that it is the true beginning of the Bible, that all of Genesis is basically a prologue to Exodus. And that's not meant to disrespect the theology and story of Genesis, but to simply say that the story of Genesis is not complete without Exodus and what comes after, and the story of Exodus is not fully understood without the shadow of Genesis stretching across it. The author writes, Exodus is the true heart of the Old Testament, in some respects more foundational than Genesis for Old Testament theology. The author says this, "It would be hard to find a single major topic of Old or even New Testament that is not exemplified in the book of Exodus." We have the foundation for the theology of redemption, of worship, of morality, of law, of priesthood and prophet, of persecution, of holiness, of covenant. We would be hard-pressed to find a book in the Old Testament that does not quote or allude to Exodus in some way, and the same is true even for the New Testament. When we get to the New Testament, Christ's birth, his ministry, his death, his resurrection are all described in ways that use the canvas of Exodus as a backdrop. Biblical theology is saturated with Exodus. Is it a book worth studying? The book describes the redemption of Israel, God's nation. It is a new beginning for them. And we're going to find the book quite instructive in helping us to lay a foundation of who God is and what he has called us to believe and do as his church. The word Exodus, you're not going to find anywhere in the book, strangely enough. The word itself means exit or departure, and the word is a Latinized term of the Greek version's title for the book of Exodus. The Jews called the book, "And these are the names," which is basically the first two words of the book in Hebrew. But even the title Exodus doesn't quite grasp the fullest extent of this book. The first half of the book is an exodus from Egypt, but the second half is camped at the foot of a mountain where the Israelites meet their deliverer, God. Let's begin reading 1:1. "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household." Now, there is something missing there. Exodus was originally written by a man named Moses, who we're going to meet in the coming weeks. And Moses didn't know English, which means the book was originally written in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the book starts like this, "And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt." Now, that's 14 words in English, but only 6 words in Hebrew. And the reason I point that out is to say that the book starts with the word and these are the names. What kind of book would start with the word "and"? I went to 3rd grade. My teacher told me over and over again never to start a sentence with "and." I'd get marks off my paper if I started a sentence with "and." Did Moses skip the 3rd grade? I don't think so. Actually, there are a number of historical books in the Old Testament that begin with the word "and." Leviticus, Numbers, Joshua, Samuel. We could add many others there. Judges, Ruth, Kings, Ezra, Esther. Most narrative books of the Old Testament start with a verb, and they start with the word "and" attached to that verb. You don't begin with an "and" if it's the first book of a series. An "and" implies that there was something before this that you should know about. It's a connecting word. Now here, what is it connecting to? It's connecting to Genesis. If Genesis is a prologue to Exodus, it is a necessary prologue. It is essential in understanding the theology and purpose of Exodus itself. Exodus is the continuation of the Genesis story. So before we get any further than "and," let's look back through Genesis and remind ourselves of some of the foundational texts that are going to inform this book of Exodus. Let's begin with Genesis 1:28. The Bible opens with God creating the heavens and the earth. Day by day, he creates animals on land and in the sea and in the air from nothing, just by speaking them into existence. The pinnacle of all that creation is when God creates man and woman, Adam and Eve, the only creatures in the world that are said to be created in God's image. It says in Genesis 1:28, and God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So after mankind is blessed, they are to be fruitful and multiplied. They are to fill the earth, they are to subdue it, they are to have dominion over every animal on the earth. That's mankind's task and commission by God. This is an important text that we're going to come back to in just a few minutes towards the end of the sermon. I want you to remember Genesis 1:28. Well, the story of Genesis goes on. Adam and Eve are told they can eat from any fruit of any tree they want in the Garden of Eden, except for one tree. They can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So you know what they do, right? And yeah, we can be quick to blame them, but remember, they're just kids in a grown-up's body, which is how I imagine myself sometimes, quite frankly. But they take the fruit, they eat it, and sin enters the picture in Genesis chapter 3. God does make a promise to take care of that sin one day. The offspring of Eve will crush the head of the serpent. The book of Genesis in a large part develops that offspring idea, and that's a main part of its theology. But I want to fast forward to Genesis 15. There we see a man named Abram, later to be called Abraham. God has previously promised Abram to give him great blessing, innumerable offspring, the land of Canaan. Here, God reiterates that promise in a formal covenant. God assures Abram that he is blessed and that his offspring will come from him and his wife, not his concubine. And regarding the land part of the promise, God tells him, then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. This is prophecy. God is saying that the offspring of Abram will certainly spend quite a bit of time in a land that is not their own. They will be servants there, meaning slaves. It won't be a very happy or a pleasant time. They will be afflicted. Now, usually you don't use that word afflicted for having a good time. How was your vacation to Disney, Pastor Bryan? Well, I felt quite afflicted. Thank you for asking. No, afflicted is a hard word. It's a painful word. They will be slaves in a foreign land. But God promises judgment on that nation, and after 400 years, they'll leave it with great possessions. So the prophecy is saying that the land of Canaan is for your descendants, Abram, but there will be a period of 4 centuries where they will experience slavery in another land, after which I'll deliver them and bring them back here, and they will be rich. The rest of the story of Genesis plays with that land theme. Abram has a son, Isaac. Isaac has a son, Jacob, also known as Israel. Israel has 12 sons, all this still in the promised land. One of Jacob's sons is named Joseph. Now, while he was still a teenager, Joseph bragged a bit too much about the sweet Gucci coat that his dad bought for him, and his brothers ended up faking his death and selling him into slavery. You know that story. Joseph gets passed along to Egypt, but God is at work. After a few years and a few bad dreams, he becomes number 2 in command, just under Pharaoh himself. And God has used Joseph in Egypt to predict a worldwide famine. But Egypt is prepared, and the starving nations begin to migrate to them for help, including Joseph's family and ultimately his father Israel. Joseph invites the whole family to relocate to Egypt until the famine is over, and by God's direction, they do. Now look with me for a moment at Genesis 46. Is beginning to make the journey with his family down to Egypt, but he's worried. God promised him Canaan. He didn't promise him Egypt. Should he leave the promised land even for a famine? But God intervenes, and the Lord says in verse 2, God spoke to Israel in visions in the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So we know that Egypt is that nation that Israel and his people will spend time in, predicted in Genesis 15. 400 years of time, some of it in slavery and affliction. The rest of Genesis 46 is a list of names of the sons of Israel and their families that went on the sojourn from Canaan to Egypt during Joseph's time. In fact, the first 6 words of Genesis 46 verse. Now these are the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt. That's 6 words in Hebrew, 14 words in English. They are the exact same words used to begin the book of Exodus. In other words, it's not just the "and" that opens the book of Exodus that ties this story together with Genesis. The first 6 words of Exodus rewinds us backwards to the time of the migration of Israel and his family from Canaan to Egypt. And that's very interesting because Genesis has another 4 chapters after chapter 46. In chapter 50, Joseph dies. Read about that in verses 24 to 26. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made his sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now notice how that book ends. In Egypt. Genesis ends in Egypt with Joseph dead and the family still there outside the promised land. But the book of Exodus opens up with a quote from chapter 46 of Genesis, rewinding us a bit further back than we would expect. And I think it does this to focus us not on Joseph, but instead on the patriarchs themselves, the 12 sons of Israel. Look at the next few verses of the book of Exodus. We'll start again in verse 1. "And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation." So here we have a list of Israel's 12 sons. Each one had their own household of wives and kids that they brought with them to Egypt. The narrator tells us that all the descendants of Israel who came to Egypt were 70, not including Joseph since he was already there waiting for them. Joseph dies, his brothers die, that whole generation dies, and they're still in Egypt. You know what the problem was with remaining in Egypt? Egypt wasn't Canaan. God promised them the land of Canaan. Anything less was beneath the promise of God. 70 people came out of Canaan to the land of Egypt, and then they stay there. Now, 70 people isn't a lot. I mean, you might think 70 people is a lot. If I had 70 people crash my house for a party, that's a lot. 70 people over dinner, that's a lot. 70 people to pick up from the airport, 70 diapers to change. I mean, 70 is a lot in some contexts, but it's not a lot of people for a people group. If I were to say that there was a nation with only 70 people, that's when you would say that's not a lot. So the text here is emphasizing that they began with only 70. God took one guy, Abraham, gave him a kid, gave his kid a kid, gave that kid 12 sons, gave each of those sons some family, and then took those 70 people and exploded them into the nation called Israel. You see, it's not a lot, but that's just the point. God started with not a lot, and he made it something great, something more numerous than the sand on the seashore. And look at how Moses describes this population in verse 7. "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." Now, I highlighted a few words. Maybe that gives you some clues, but did you notice something here? Do you hear the echoes? Let me remind you of something we heard in the very beginning of this sermon, Genesis 1:28. God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it." Now, hopefully you see it now. You look at the words that overlap between these two. Genesis says, "Be fruitful," and then Exodus says the people of Israel were fruitful. Genesis says, "Multiply." Exodus says they multiplied. Genesis says, "Fill the earth," and Exodus says the land was filled with them. Now notice I have 2 verbs underlined here, subdue and have dominion. Exodus doesn't pick up on those verbs. We were talking about animals in Genesis, but now we're onto the Egyptians in Exodus. And in Exodus, the Egyptians are the ones doing the subduing and dominating, not Israel, at least for now, at this part of the story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're focusing on those verbs: fruitful, multiply, filled. But Exodus goes even beyond Genesis. Notice how the book of Exodus adds 2 more verbs. The people of Israel increased greatly, and they grew exceedingly strong. Each of those 5 verbs in verse 7 of Exodus 1 has a unique nuance to it. God says they were fruitful. That's an agricultural analogy. When a tree bears fruit, it doesn't just bear 1 or 2 pieces. Unless my wife is its gardener, then it would only bear 1 or 2 pieces, but it bears much fruit. The Israelites were fruitful, reproducing like a fruit tree. They increased greatly. Literally, the text there reads swarmed, a word that's usually used of fish or insects. They weren't reproducing like a bunch of rabbits. They were reproducing like a school of guppies. They were reproducing like an egg sack of spiders. I don't know. They were reproducing. You get the point. They increased greatly. They swarmed over the earth. They multiplied. Now that's a simple word that means they became many. Notice it's not they added to themselves. It's multiplied. When you multiply, you get higher numbers much quicker than when you add. They grew exceedingly strong. This is actually one verb in Hebrew that is strengthened by 2 other words. The verb means grow strong, to grow mighty, but added to it are words that can literally be translated with abundant abundance, or exceedingly exceedingly, something like that. So you put them together and you get a population of people that are growing with abundant abundance. As the text says here, grew exceedingly strong. That double use of abundant is only used 3 other times previous to Exodus in the book of Genesis, all in chapter 17. Look there for a moment with me. Genesis 17. This is a text that relates to what we're talking about today. Genesis 17 starts off when Abram was 99 years old. The Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Literally, the text reads there, multiply you with abundant abundance. Notice the word multiply there as well, creational language with covenantal implications. Well, the text then goes on, then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. You could read that literally, I will make you fruitful with abundant abundance. Notice again the word fruitful there, creational language in a covenantal context. So I will make you fruitful with abundant abundance. I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Are you getting this yet? Moses is saturating Exodus 1:7 with creational covenantal language, much of which was pulled from the book of Genesis. They were fruitful, they increased greatly, they multiplied, they grew strong with abundant abundance. And then it says in verse 7 again, the land was filled with them. Filled, meaning that there's no room left over. It would be hard to squeeze another few of them in there. If they were parking at a mall, there's not a free spot open. If they were buying houses, they were all taken. It was packed with Israelites. Why? Because God is fulfilling his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, what I'm pointing out is that I think Moses wants us to understand this opening paragraph in connection with everything that's gone before it. It's not just a matter of the Israelites increasing in population. It was a fantastic increase, there's no doubt about it. But the increase was a result of God beginning to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Israel. The covenantal promises of God were beginning to be fulfilled. They were gearing up to become a nation. They were ready to go back to Canaan. They were being blessed by God. But I want you to see all these callbacks to Genesis, that God's creational purposes were being fulfilled in Israel too. In creation, God blesses Adam and Eve, and he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, here we see God's covenantal and creational blessings happening before our very eyes. The Israelites are now being fruitful and multiplying and filling the land of Egypt. Beyond that, they were increasing greatly. They were growing strong with abundant abundance. What the narrator of Exodus is telling us, right from the very beginning, is that Israel is a new creation, a new nation, a new beginning between God and humankind. This is as momentous and significant an occasion as when God started humanity in the garden. It's as momentous and significant an occasion as when God restarted humanity after the flood. Adam and Eve screwed up, but God doesn't throw in the towel and stop there. He starts anew with Israel, a new creation, and God intends to fulfill his creational purposes through the people of Israel. And spoiler alert, when Israel screws up and rejects her Messiah, guess what God does? He still doesn't throw in the towel, but he sends Christ to the cross, Israel par excellence, so that you and I could be made into a new creation as well. Now, we're going to see a lot more of this creational theology in Exodus if you stick through these sermons. You're going to see it sermon after sermon. I'll remind you of it as the text keeps it in front of us. I want you to notice too, though, that we keep attributing these actions to God, and yet God isn't mentioned in the text yet. His work in fulfilling his covenantal and creational promises is so evident in this text, we don't even need to see his name written there. We see his work. But what does this text point us to? How do we apply it? I think that the big idea here is to worship God, fulfiller of his covenantal and creational promises. When we look at the history of how God has interacted with his people, we see evidence of his faithfulness and redemptive love towards his people. Frankly, sometimes it seems like a long time before God fulfills his promises. You know how many times as a pastor I get the question, do you think that we're in the end times? As a professor, I get that question all the time. Do you think the Lord's coming back in our generation? My kids ask me this question a lot. That might literally be the number one question I get as a pastor, professor, and even as a dad. You know why I hear that question so often? Because creation groans as it awaits the fulfillment of God's promises. You ask, are we in this last time? Because you groan, awaiting the fulfillment of God's promises. We can't wait for God to return. He promises to come back. He promises to restore order to this sin-marred world. He promised all the way back in Genesis 3, right after creation was struck by the effects of sin. He promised to bring us back to that Edenic state before the fall of man. He will come. He will restore the world. He will resurrect and glorify us. You know how I can be sure of that? Because a group of 70 people once went into Egypt. They stayed there for 4 centuries, and then they left as a nation, just as God promised. You know what Jesus said? Jesus once said, "What is the kingdom of God like? And to what shall I compare it? It's like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his garden, and it grew and became a tree, and the birds of the air made nests in its branches." You, church, are visible proof of God fulfilling his promises. Just as Israel was and is, so you are too. God took 12 men, Jesus' disciples. From them he sent out 70 or 72, depending on which text you're reading, Luke chapter 10, to be witnesses to the world. And from them began the church, you and I and all those around the world. When I study through the book of the Bible, what I like to do is to try to take a step back and grasp the big picture of the entire book. I think hopefully by now you've seen the big picture of this opening paragraph. But what is the author going to say to us in the whole book itself? I mean, each chapter, each story has a point, but there is an argument being made that ties together the entirety of the book of Exodus. So for Exodus, what I've also done here is I've done my best to boil down the big idea of this book into one sentence, 9 words long. Here it is, the of Exodus. Serve God, Creator and Redeemer, who dwells among us. You're going to see this sermon after sermon, just why I chose those words to represent this book. In this sermon, I hope that you saw that the word creator in this text comes to the forefront. God is fulfilling his creational purposes in the people of Israel. But this is going to be our theme for the next many sermons as we study through the book of Exodus. Serve God, creator and redeemer, who dwells among us. I hope that this short passage today has given you enough to whet your appetite to come back and to listen to more. Because I've got to warn you, the next verse, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That spells big trouble for God's people. But rest assured, God is bigger than that trouble.